I'll keep you moderately honest. I'll keep you. When you're talking about the technology, there's a lot.
There's too much. Overload.
Very high level.
Yeah.
Very high.
Yeah, now they're pouring it.
It's like kids in school, last minute in.
All right. We're all procrastinators. We humans are. All right, David, you got me? All right, we're recording. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to PFAS Forum 4. My name is Eugene Jones. I'm the executive director for a nonprofit up in Tallahassee called the Southern Waste Exchange. We assist industry and municipalities with waste issues. My 30-second elevator pitch is basically I'm a waste matchmaker. I put Waste Generator in touch with waste users to encourage recycling and reuse of waste materials. And in addition to that, part of our function is to provide education and networking in the environmental industry, which is hence what we're here to do today, is to learn and to network. Let me make a couple of opening comments real quickly before I turn it over to the panel, because I know that's why what you're here for, is to listen to what's going to be discussed over the next day and a half. First off, if everybody could silence their cell phones. Restrooms, if you haven't found them already, they're out this door to your left by the escalator on the left-hand side. Conference support, if anybody needs anything, please visit us at the front desk and our staff can assist you. With regard to what you're going to see, we are recording everything via Zoom. Welcome our virtual attendees. We will prepare those recordings and I'll try to get those out to everybody next week. We'll have a YouTube channel, along with a PDF of the presentations that will be presented. We do provide an attendance list to everybody, names and affiliations. Our VIP registrants, sponsors, and exhibitors are going to get full contact information. So if you don't want your information released, please let me know. Networking opportunities, everything, all the breaks, the receptions are going to be in the exhibit hall. We have lunch today is going to be in Signature 2, which is upstairs. So you're going to have to go up the escalators, and we'll have some direction signs to tell everybody where to be. Topgolf event, I think we have a couple of extra openings for Topgolf. So if somebody has an interest in attending tonight, let us know. The price is $75, and it doesn't include dinner. We're doing something different this year. It does not include dinner, but it is, bar snacks and then 3 hours of unlimited Topgolf play, and I think 3 hours of open bar, beer and wine. Abstracts and speakers, I've asked all our moderators not to read abstracts or bios. That was provided to everybody in the compendium that I sent out. All of that is on the website. If you want to use a QR code, you can download that if you want more details in terms of what's being presented. I would encourage everybody, part of the networking function is to take advantage of the networking, and our LinkedIn group is now popped up to over 1,100 people. So that kind of shows you the interest of what's going on, and I expect that number to continue to grow. Certificate of attendance, for those of you that need continuing education, we do offer a certificate of attendance. There is a charge of $25, and we have up to 12.25 hours of continuing education. Moderator and speaker evaluation. This is your chance to be a teacher. I need to have you all critique the presenters. So if you can, whether it's today or when you get back home, I will be sending out the evaluation link to everybody, and I'd like your feedback on individual presenters as they go through what they're going to be talking about. Lastly, this conference wouldn't, or any conference for that fact, wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the sponsors. So real quick shout out to BioLargo, Goldstein Environmental Law Firm, and Montrose Environmental as our gold sponsors. Our silver sponsors, we've got a plethora of silver sponsors, so I won't read everybody here right now, but thank you for our silver sponsors. And then supporting organizations, they are typically nonprofits that help us get the word out about the event and what's going on. And organization, in terms of it, it is the Southern Waste Information Exchange. We've got Florida State University involved in it, INSTEP, and Environmental Industry Conference Management, which is what my wife Dana does. Real quickly, a little bit of promo. We're going to be doing the Florida Remediation Conference November 4th through the 6th, right back here at the Rosen Center. And then lastly, I just signed the contract yesterday. We're going to be back here next year for PFAS Forum 5, a little bit earlier, April 9th through the 11th. So go ahead and mark your dates, and I'm sure we'll again be attracting more people as everybody learns what's going on in the industry and how to deal with this. So that is my opening comments real quick. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Jorge Caspary, with Montrose Environmental. And Montrose, you're going to be in good hands because this gentleman knows this and is working this in Tallahassee up on the Capitol day in and day out, trying to figure out how we deal with this from a legislative standpoint. So, Jorge, it is all yours, sir.
Thank you.
Steal that.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming. Good morning. For those of you that are from out of Florida and coming back, welcome from exile. It's a nice place. It's a nice month to be in Florida. The facilities are incredible. I only know two people that can put up a good conference. One is Gene, and another one, my former partner, Jeff Littlejohn. So I'm going to have a few introductory slides to set the stage for what can we expect from PFAS in Florida in 2025, 2024. And then I'll start with the panelists here. I'll move quite fast, and I am just going to touch on some subjects that will be dealt in depth by the panelists today and tomorrow. A brief historical context. In 2018, few of us in Florida could spell PFAS. For those attending the 2019 summer school, this issue began to raise its head. 2021, we knew that this issue would explode sometime in the future. And some of you may remember what was the theme of the 2021 PFAS Forum that Gene organized? Winter is coming. That was the theme, you remember. Well, 3 years later, winter is here. And we knew this was going to come in Florida. It's been around for a while in different states. But in Florida, I would say the things are going to be changing. So what have we learned so far? It's a multifaceted issue, and nobody's got all the answers. I can tell you that. Nobody's got all the answers. Remediation will be long, and as far as I know, there is no in situ destruction yet. People are working, they have bench tests, but nothing really extrapolated to a marketable in situ destruction. We are understanding macro versus micro risk. Micro risk is a gas station, macro risk is an area-wide pollution, a plume that may be 5-6 blocks. We're beginning to understand how to apply that concept to potential remedial outcomes. We really don't know yet in Florida how we're going to grapple with the hazardous substance designation that came out of EPA. Is that going to affect real estate? Is that going to, what are the effects in Florida? It's too early to tell. I can tell you that there will be immediate challenges to the rule right now, at least the designating PFAS hazardous substances. I think the deadline expires on June 8th. I understand an immediate appeal or a challenge will be filed in the court up in DC. I have witnessed a strong push for cleanup liability relief by some airports, cities, fire departments, because these guys were mandated to use these substances by the federal government. I suppose one could sue the federal government, and my good friend Ralph DeMeo can probably talk about that. We still don't know, at least in Florida, who will pay for this. We don't know. The legislature, and I'll dwell this very briefly, somebody's going to have to pay to address this. And up at this point, the only entity paying is the federal government, because they have unlimited access to funds, DOD. Cities, municipalities in Florida, they have not addressed this in a in a reasonable manner in the private sector, it doesn't know what's going to hit him in the next few years. Rush, we learned that a lot of states, have reacted independently, faster, slower. They already got standards promulgated. Not in Florida. Florida took a little bit of a step back. In 2021, 2022, a PFAS coalition was formed. This is made of counties, airports, independent airport authorities, municipalities in the solid waste industry. The coalition asked for a timeout in Florida, meaning things were rushing too fast. So they went up to the legislature and said, timeout. We need a timeout. We need to figure out, we need to grapple this problem. The legislation came about in 2022, which I'm going to summarize it here because I know that Ralph and other panelists will deal with this a lot in depth. But in essence said, look, there cannot be any enforcement against a public entity until DEP comes up with a promulgated standard that needs to be ratified. The key word here is ratification, because the legislature inserted themselves in the process, and ratification means only one thing. For those of you that went through the stormwater rule here in Florida, it took 2 years to ratify because the legislature wanted to know the costs. So in Florida, the State Senate and the House want to know how much is this going to cost before they can agree to have a promulgated groundwater standard. That doesn't mean that the federal standard is not going to be probably a de facto standard. It probably will be, and most of you know probably it's going to be around 4 to 10 parts per trillion. 2023, there was an additional proposed legislation that would have required risk-based corrective action to address this, but that failed. But what did we get in 2024, a couple of months ago? The legislature began to train its eyes on this issue. And it clearly said industrial users identified as probable sources. And more importantly, if you read it, it says, we shall create an initiative. As you know, I was a director at DEP. An initiative means a program. Just like the petroleum program or the dry cleaner program, the legislature is leaning towards creating a PFAS program in the state of Florida. That's important. If you have any experience with the petroleum program or the dry cleaner program, here is a seed being planted by the legislature saying, oh, we need to grapple this issue, so we're going to create an initiative. Well, an initiative evolves into a program, okay? So a timeout is in effect right now until January 2025. So let's see what's beyond the horizon, at least in Florida, and where we may be going. Mid-2023 to now, the PFAS coalition met with DEP. It met with DEP. I was part of that meeting. DEP asked the coalition to address this in the broadest possible way. They wanted feedback. And they asked for recommendation and potential legislative actions. We all understand that to address PFAS in the state of Florida, we need a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift begins to understand what is the magnitude of the problem. How big is the problem in Florida? Who really is exposed? As you know, most of Florida draws its drinking water from groundwater, but at the same time, most municipalities provide potable water to their customers. But there's a sizable number of inhabitants in our state that have private potable wells. By law, those private potable wells have to be sampled every 5 years, all of them, hundreds of thousands of wells. And so there is a program at the Department of Health that has to sample those wells. Well, we recommended, the coalition recommended, well, let's begin to see who really is exposed. If we're going to come up with some costs, we need some numbers. Sustainable long-term risk corrective action probably is the paradigm shift that is going to be changing this. Note if this sampling program at DOH reveals private wells that are affected by PFAS above 4 parts per trillion, then you notify DEP. Then you begin to formulate a plan of action. Are they, as my friend Michael said, are they in environmental justice communities? Most people with private wells are in old neighborhoods. You know, they couldn't afford to join the municipal water supply. So, also, the statute requires cost-effective source reduction. And right now, at least in my experience, pump and treat is the only remediation technology that's readily available. But as we know, there's a point of diminishing returns in pump and treat. And so at what point in time you reach the definition of cost-effective source reduction in order to apply a risk-based corrective action approach? But again, a paradigm shift needs to happen. It probably will happen where the actual risk is the one that needs to be addressed in the state of Florida. And DEP is open to that. Let me tell you a few potential legislative initiatives in 2025 based on conversations I've had up in Tallahassee and Tampa and with some peers. Any groundwater to be extracted from a permitted private well located in a suspected area must be tested. Any new well has to be tested for PFAS. Funding, as my friend Michael Goldstein yesterday said, we have proposed funding to DEP, DOH, the Department of Health, who's charged to monitor these private wells, and the water management districts to expand their testing and well testing and permitting approach based on a GIS platform, readily available to the public. We need to know where PFAS is and isn't in order to develop the costs for remediation. If you have a private well and PFAS is detected, well, you know, there's a program that provides filtration. Expand funding to that program. Fiscal incentive to airports and cities to acquire PFAS-free AFFF to fund training also on this. There's going to be a transition that airports, which are the likely sources of this, need to address. Strong discussions on liability relief or cleanup when responding to an emergency using all AFFF stocks. What happens if there's a crash and the airport has to use this old? Have they created a release? Some airports feel that's unfair because they haven't transitioned to a fluorine-free AFFF. So do we save a life or we protect the environment? What is the balance here? Funding to retrofit at the state level, retrofit airports, cities, fire departments to fluorine-free stocks. That's a discussion being taken up in Tallahassee and probably will happen. Airports, big airports such as Tampa, if you flew to Tampa or flew to Orlando, they have some means to transition. Small general aviation airports don't. Or smaller airports like smaller cities don't have those funds. Transition is the word in the industry right now, at least in airports. The transition. They realize regulatory response is coming. I understand there's 2 or 3 vendors already that have mil-spec fluorine-free foam ready to be purchased. The stocks are there. I imagine some airports are beginning to transition. There's not a requirement right now for airports to switch, but the hazardous substance designation at EPH, which will be challenged, has triggered some airports to begin this transition. They realize the inevitable is going to happen. Winter is here. That will trigger reporting obligations, for sure. But when we spoke to DEP a couple of weeks ago, probably regulatory response in terms of remedial obligations. So airports will have to do 2 things. You can't deal with contamination within your property in Florida, Outside of your property is where all bets are off. If PFAS have migrated beyond your property boundary into private property, all bets are off in Florida. How do we deal with that? Is an airport liable, responsible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Transition, there will be required new training. As you know, the dosing systems, the dispensing systems are very different from fluorine-containing AFFF to fluorine-free. Who's going to pay for that? The changes on retrofitting equipment run between $50,000 and $200,000 per Oshkosh truck. Who's going to pay for that? The taxpayers in Florida, the taxpayers at the federal government. That said, last week the FAA came with $350 million in grants to airports. Granted, the money is not appropriated yet in the federal government and probably will not be appropriated until after the election. And so, but the feds realize that there has to be some money to begin to address this problem, at least at airports. So $350 million is a good start. The money's not there yet, but it's part of the budget negotiations between the House and the Senate up in DC. That will be managed probably by the state DOT through their aviation department, or airports can incur in the transition and ask for a reimbursement of funds down the road. But the money is beginning to come. It's a good start. Specific issues in Florida, regulatory challenges. From previous experience, the groundwater, surface water interlink, it's important. We are surrounded by surface water. I would advise consultants and clients, attorneys, that interlink is critical. You can deal with groundwater in Florida through risk-based, but when PFAS is migrating to surface water, then that's a different approach. Stormwater, the stormwater rule just got ratified by the legislature. It is likely that in the future, PFAS will be added to the stormwater monitoring as part of MS4s or ERPs. POTW discharges, important. As you know, we send most of our wastewater to POTW. I mean, septic tanks are on their way out. You know, if you're in a septic tank industry, that's not a good place to be. But so we discharge too. But where does a POTW discharge its waters in Florida? To surface waters. And guess what? The legislature saw fit that that cannot happen anymore. So that interlink of POTW, if you're in a utility, pay attention to this issue. I put Milcom projects, I will say construction projects in Florida. As you know, Florida is a growth state. What is going to happen with dewatering in a suspected PFAS area? Do you have to add budget to filter out PFAS to a non-promulgated surface water standard, or you just discharge to surface waters? FDP's got surface water screening levels. They're low, but they are right now screening levels. It's likely that in the future, DEP will train its eyes and develop a surface water standard for this. Again, part of risk-based corrective action is a form of institutional controls in order to control costs of remediation. We all know here, and you'll hear, remediation for PFAS or even assessment is not cheap. And we all have clients, or we all have bosses, and they want to know the costs. How much is it going to cost and for how long? But in Florida at least, institutional controls recorded and unrecorded are a way to control those costs. Last but not least, I'll say this. There's a hazardous waste designation being talked about in DC. That will change everything. Absolutely, because RCRA gets involved, and those of you that have worked in RCRA, you know, it's literally the 12 stations of the cross dealing with the EPA. It's really hard. So, don't panic. Winter has arrived in Florida. Thank you for being here, and then I'll go ahead and see the rest of the next panelist. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Well, he said don't panic, but there's going to be a little bit more of that to come. So I'm going to kick things off with the state of federal regulatory action. So for those of you who have not been paying attention the last couple months, buckle your seatbelts. So before we dive into the specific federal regulatory actions, I just want to make a comment about the regulatory landscape right now. And that starts with how we're even defining PFAS, what it is we are trying to regulate. And This is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch. In fact, it's only getting more and more convoluted. About 14 years ago, we had a working definition for PFAS that was globally accepted, and it included about 200 substances. And I remember at that time when we thought that was a lot to get our arms around, how we were going to address that many. Now in 2024, we have a variety of different definitions for what constitutes a PFAS, and depending on which definition you're using, that could include thousands or tens of thousands or millions of substances. So OECD is an international organization, and they've provided a definition that the EU uses, and right now their definition includes about 7 million substances. In the US, the EPA has multiple different definitions that we use. And of course, this ever-expanding or broadening definition of what constitutes a PFAS is happening against the background of these ever-decreasing human health risk values. So a pretty rocky foundation to build upon. And this is a snapshot of what it looks like within the EPA in the US. So these are the different regulatory programs and the different approaches that the EPA is taking depending on the program. So whether it's drinking water monitoring, regulation, wastewater monitoring, CERCLA or RCRA, TSCA, there's an approach from addressing just a couple of PFAS to tens of PFAS to PFAS as a class, and then using different definitions for that class of what constitutes a PFAS. And P.S., this changes constantly. Okay, so let's start with some of those regulatory activities. And under TSCA, so for those of you who are not familiar, TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act. This is essentially where anybody in the US who wants to introduce a chemical into commerce has to let the EPA know about it. So they say, this is the new chemical, and here's a bunch of information on its safety, health, risk effects, et cetera. As you can imagine, this didn't work out so well for PFAS. So now they're trying to do it over. So there's this look back now, back to anybody who has manufactured or imported PFAS according to the definition that they use for this rule of what they say constitutes a PFAS since January of 2011. And so there's a lot of information they're asking for people to report on this, and they have a very short time to report it. This law was adopted last fall, and they've got 18 months to report for most entities. There's some small businesses that get up to 24 months. So once this reporting obligation is final, then we're probably going to get some additional information on PFAS uses and industries, and the EPA estimates that they're going to get data on about 1,400 PFAS compounds from this effort. Kind of along the same vein of reporting obligations, there's something called the Toxics Release Inventory Rule. So industries have to report on chemicals that they emit to the environment, whether that's the air, the water, land, including land disposal. And under the TRI, there's a specific list of 196 PFAS, and this list grows constantly, that are subject to this rule. And this gets reported on annually, and there used to be this de minimis clause. So in the first several years of this rule, the EPA didn't get much data, a lot less than they expected to. And it turns out it's because of that de minimis clause. So PFAS are pretty powerful chemicals, and they don't have to be used in very large quantities to impart their effect. So a lot of people kind of flew under the radar under that de minimis level. So EPA got rid of the de minimis exemption last fall, and now everybody has to report. So we will see the results of this in July of next year. So again, we have to wait a little while, but that also should be far more illuminating than it was the last few years. And then, I mentioned this broadening definition of what constitutes a PFAS, whether it's hundreds, thousands, or millions. We're never going to have all the information we need on each individual compound from its health effects and risk profile to being able to analyze and test for it. So the EPA is tackling this through something they call the National PFAS Testing Strategy. So they've gone through and looked at 2,000 different PFAS substances, and they've categorized them based on similarities that they have, chemical, structural, things like that. And they've tried to identify manufacturers of those chemicals, and they've identified 24. So they have these 24 representative PFAS of this broader group of chemicals, and they're asking those manufacturers to provide a lot of information. So they have to do their own toxicity testing and provide that data. So they have a much longer time frame to comply with this. So far, the EPA has only issued 4 test orders. So it's a lengthy, slow-moving process, but it is underway. But those manufacturers have almost 500 days to provide those data. So again, you're going to have to wait a little while, but they are moving this process along. Now that said, they are still chipping away at individual toxicity assessments for the compounds that we think of today as our risk drivers. Also a pretty slow-moving process, but you can kind of track this. So these are the ones that you'll find they update the IRIS database with for those regional screening levels once they have these toxicity assessments completed, and you can see the ones that are kind of in the queue or in the process right now. And then because of all of these reporting obligations that are coming into play, I think it's also helpful to know that EPA has established this database that's basically just a searchable platform for all of their databases where data are publicly made publicly available. And so you can go in here to this ECHO platform and start searching for all of this information that's getting reported on, whether it's drinking water or wastewater or national testing strategies. All of that data is going to be TRI data. It's all going to be available in this one searchable platform. And just know that everyone's going to have access to this and be using this, right? Whether you're looking for information to help your site assessment investigation, or it's people looking to find information to initiate lawsuits, this is just all going to be in that public domain. Okay, so EPA's #1 priority has been drinking water, and this is a really long process to establishing a drinking water federal MCL, which is probably why the EPA hasn't done it in decades. But so now we are kind of in a transitionary period. There's something called the UCMR, the Unregulated Contaminants Monitoring Rule. This is where the scientific community says, hey, EPA, you don't currently regulate for these compounds. We think you should. So they propose compounds that they think are prevalent and have a risk, and then the EPA considers monitoring for them around the country in public water systems. So that's what they do under UCMR. They did this 10 years ago, or now 14 years ago, where they looked for just 6 compounds, and in that group was PFOA and PFOS. Now they're doing this all over again under UCMR 5, and they're looking for 29 PFAS compounds. So in 10 years, we went from 6 compounds to 29 compounds. And you can see the data coming in from the UCMR in real time. They have something called a data finder on their website. They just released their latest summary last month of kind of where things stand. And you used to be able to see just the frequency of detection for compounds like PFOA and PFAS, but now because we have the final drinking water MCLs, they've kind of changed how they present those data, because you wouldn't exceed an MCL with a single point in time detection. It's about the running annual average. So now they're presenting those data in terms of the average. And so then you see the percentage of exceedances in public water systems start to go down. So you've got 7.9, 6.4% of water systems with an exceedance of PFOA or PFAS. HFPODA, which is often referred to as Gen X, is virtually not detected. Only one public water system has had a detection for it. Similarly for PFNA, only 3 public water systems. And then the health, or the hazard index, which I'll talk about in a few moments, also pretty low exceedances of that so far. We are about 35% of the way through all of the results that they expect to be reported throughout the course of the UCMR 5 monitoring rule. And then one little interesting tidbit, I think, is that rule required 2 analytical methods to be used, 537.1 and 533. Those are both drinking water methods, and for any of you who've been kind of confused about what to do with those 2 methods for the last several years, I think this helps us because almost none of those compounds from 537.1 have even been detected. Only one of those compounds has been detected once. So maybe that tells us we can put a pin in it and move on and just use 533. So the kind of end of that drinking water rulemaking process is where we set an MCL, which EPA has just done for a handful of compounds, and those range from 4 to 10 part per trillion or nanogram per liter. And then there's also this hazard index approach. And then the EPA also provided additional funding for public water systems, so $1 billion in additional funding. That's in addition to what was already in the infrastructure bill. So the hazard index approach looks like this. It's basically addressing co-contaminants. So if you have 2 or more of these present, then you have to do this calculation. And it's basically as simple as taking the concentration that's present in the sample, dividing it by its either MCL or health advisory limit, and then summing it all together. And if that exceeds 1, then you've exceeded the hazard index. And so if any 2 of those at 10 ppt were present, right, above 5 parts per trillion, you'd exceed the hazard index. 5 parts per trillion is a pretty trace level. So although the UCMR data isn't showing a lot of those exceedances yet, like I said, we're only 35% of the way through those data. So we'll have to wait and see just how prevalent those exceedances are. And then kind of runner-up to EPA's priorities on drinking water were wastewater. Now, the activities under wastewater are a little more guidance-related rather than promulgated law-related, but this is what the activities look like. So the EPA published their Effluent Guidelines Program Plan 15 in January of last year. And in that plan, they outlined all these different sectors, industrial sectors, that they thought either would benefit from having effluent guidelines established for them, and then ones they thought it wasn't necessary, but they'd just keep an eye on it, maybe do some more studying, research, monitoring, and see if anything changed. Well, at the same time EPA was publishing that plan, Congress was publishing the National Defense Authorization Act. And Congress decided EPA would address all of those sectors and on their specific timeline. So that's why you see in parentheses in green where it says NDAA and a date. That's what Congress has mandated EPA will do that conflicts with what EPA said they would do in their plan. So we'll have to see. Some of those dates are coming up pretty quickly. We'll have to see what EPA does about that. And then also in that program, Plan 15, the EPA published that they were going to initiate this influent POTW study. And so what they're doing here is really just looking for additional sources that they were not otherwise aware of. So they, on the last page, you saw those different sectors that they know are potential sources for PFAS, but we don't know what we don't know yet with PFAS, and so they're looking for those additional potential sources. So they're pretty far along in this study process right now. They've identified the 400 largest POTWs around the country, which represent about 2,000 different industrial users. And they're going to collect the industrial discharge from those companies, the influent and effluent and biosolids from the POTW, and they are going to analyze them for the 40 compounds in their new 1633 method, as well as adsorbable organic fluorine. Anybody in this room know what that is? Raise your hand. Okay, so there is no way to measure for all PFAS. You cannot conduct a direct measurement of all PFAS, whether that's thousands, tens of thousands, millions. Can't do it. We all tap out at about 100 PFAS that we can analyze for directly. So the only way to get any kind of estimation of that whole class of PFAS is to conduct a proxy analysis, an approximation of total PFAS, and that can be done using the organic fluorine content of a sample. But then that assumes all organic fluorine is representative of PFAS. Depending on your definition, it is, or it isn't. And then lastly, on the wastewater front, EPA had issued a guidance to the states back in December of 2022, and they said, look, all you states that have your own NPDES permitting authority, get to work, start permitting for PFAS in wastewater. And the states didn't really do anything over the course of 2023. And so by the end of the year, EPA says what gives. The states say, we don't feel like we have the resources and the expertise and the knowledge to do this. So then at the end of last year, EPA uploads all these resources to their website. Example permits and best management practices and example limits and all this guidance. And then they say, no more excuses, get to work. So now we're seeing the effects of that. This year, a lot of states have started adding in PFAS to their NPDES permits, and that's going to be a state-specific decision as to how they do it, whether they do it in the course of the regular renewal process, whether they do it off schedule, what limits they're going to apply, although the trend we're seeing is that they're just applying the drinking water MCLs because they lack the ability to treat for PFAS, so they need it to just be this kind of pass-through limit, essentially. Okay, so the next big ticket item for EPA was addressing PFAS as hazardous waste. And so their first action was to designate just PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, that's the Superfund law. And this is a final adopted rule. So this has been published in the Federal Register, and it goes into effect on July 8th, barring the litigation. And so the effects of this is basically, CERCLA, it's that last part that's really impactful. It's the cost and liability piece of it. So this is where EPA can come knocking and say, hey, you're responsible for this, and you need to clean it up, and you need to pay for it. And it also makes this part officially part of due diligence in phase 1 to satisfy the all appropriate inquiries rule. And I know a lot of concern is about the potential to reopen closed sites, which EPA now has the authority to do. Now, EPA has said that they don't have any intention on doing some big wholesale reopening of sites. They're going to do it in their normal course of their regular reviews, like they always do, on a case-by-case basis. They've also really emphasized their discretionary authority. So it is not their intention to go after folks that are called passive receivers, like wastewater treatment plants or landfills or maybe even fire stations. They really want to go after who they believe are the responsible parties, the polluters. Now that's all well and good, but the EPA does not have the authority to prevent anyone else from bringing a third-party claim against those passive receivers. Only Congress has that authority, and Congress has been debating for over the last year whether they should provide waivers to anybody for this CERCLA designation. And no surprise, Congress can't agree, so who knows whether anybody will ever get those waivers, and this does go into effect on July 8th, and it will apply to everyone. And then there is RCRA. And so EPA has taken one step to address PFAS under RCRA, and it's by designating these handful of chemicals you see listed there as hazardous constituents. So I don't know if you all are familiar with the distinction between constituents and waste, but there is an important distinction here. And so what this is RCRA has these two significant parts to the rule. So there's the hazardous waste, regulation of hazardous waste. This is often referred to as cradle to grave. This is where EPA can regulate the generation, transportation, final disposal, that whole cradle to grave kind of process of hazardous waste. Right now, that is not what this applies to. A hazardous constituents designation only makes these compounds subject to the corrective action side of the law. So the corrective action piece is where EPA can come knocking and say, we believe that you're responsible for this contamination and you need to clean it up. And so that is a proposed law right now. It has not been adopted. So we have to wait and see how long it takes for that to get through the process. Now, it is important to recognize that this is a step in the process to eventually getting towards a hazardous waste designation, but that's much further down the line. And then kind of lastly on the waste topic is the matter of destruction and disposal. So Congress had mandated that EPA provide a guidance document on disposal and destruction options and recommendations. And so they had to do this back in 2020. And at the time, there was just nothing but data gaps, basically. So it was congressionally mandated, so they put out this document, and it was just a state of the science and a state of the lack of information, basically. 3 years later, they had to update it. So they just published this a couple months ago. And there's a few updates to it, but not much. Still a lot of data gaps remain. But where they really focused was on demonstrating that destruction technologies are really destroying PFAS. So there is no doubt that certain technologies like incineration and the other thermal remediation technologies can break down certain PFAS, but are they breaking down all the PFAS all the way? Or are you getting these products of incomplete destruction? And so that's where EPA has focused their attention and on developing some methods to address that. In terms of disposal options, there really wasn't any update to their guidance. They just said use your professional judgment and here are the options out there. Okay, so AFFF, the aqueous film-forming foam, these are the fluorinated foams. The Congress mandated that DoD had to develop a new mil-spec, military specification, that allows them to identify products that would meet their needs that are fluorine-free. So EPA did that in January of last year. They published their new mil-spec, and then all the vendors try to get on the qualified products list that meets the mil-spec. Now, the mil-spec has some issues. There's some conflicting information in the mil-spec as to what exactly will meet the product requirements. I won't dive into those details, but just know that there are some issues if you have to get involved in that. But this is the product qualified database, so you can go on there and check in kind of real time and see when things are getting added. Right now there's 2 different products that are available on there. However, DoD is saying that even though those meet the mil-spec, they're not sufficient enough to meet their needs. So the Defense Secretary is expected to ask for an extension from Congress because they are supposed to not be using fluorinated foams as of October of this year. And they've done almost nothing to transition away from the fluorinated foams. So if they ask for that extension, it's expected to be a 2-year extension. And then FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, they basically just follow suit with whatever the DoD does. So they have issued a memo to the civilian airports saying you can start using these fluorine-free foams that are on the qualified products list, but you don't have to. And so again, we don't really see any movement towards that transition taking place. Not only do you have to feel confident that the products are going to be sufficient, but the how-to of transition is a big question that everybody's trying to figure out right now. The procedures that will be sufficient for decontaminating the systems, how do you verify they've been decontaminated before you go replacing them? And then lastly, just real quick, in an effort to support all these emerging regulations, the EPA had to develop some new methods that were capable of supporting them. So they've got the source error methods, OTM 45 and OTM 50. And this is, again, to really support those assessments of the destruction technologies. Are they completely destroying, getting full mineralization, or those products of incomplete destruction? These tests are aimed at answering that question. Do they get us all the way there? No. So there's still more work to be done. There's an OTM 55 method in the works, but not sure if we'll see that this year or not. And then on the wastewater front, there's the 1633 method. So this is applicable to all non-potable water, to soils, biosolids, and fish tissue and landfill leachate. So pretty comprehensive in supporting a lot of their regulatory initiatives. And then that adsorbable organic fluorine that I mentioned, that's a proxy for all PFAS, that's captured for water by method 1621. So these were all just released in the last couple months this year. And then lastly, the National Academies funded research to develop guidance for airports on forensic tools. And so this includes both analytical and statistical methods. And this, as you can imagine, with all of that regulation I just told you, is mounting liability for people. We are going to need more and more of these forensic applications to help people sort out whose PFAS is it, how much PFAS is yours or theirs, and the like. And so those forensic methods are going to become more and more important as well. And that's it for the federal updates. Thanks, everyone. Are we going to do questions at the end? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Q&A? Yeah, we'll have some questions at the very end, questions and answers. Bill, you're next.
Which way is?
There you go.
There we go. Okay, anybody confused yet? We've talked about regulation. We've talked about things that are coming. Let's talk about treatment. My esteemed colleague said something that I don't know how much further I can latch onto it. Right now, the methodology of choice is pump and treat. That is really the methodology of choice. And what we're going to talk about today is all of the things you need to do before you make a decision to do it. So we're going to talk about backgrounds and stepwise approaches, et cetera. So we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment. My colleagues went through that quite well today, but I'm going to talk about it as it pertains to drinking water. Water is fungible. It does not know if it's drinking water or storm water or rainwater or groundwater or construction water. All of the water that is treatable can be treated by the same methodologies. So what we're going to talk about is treatment technologies designed for drinking water, but it works for any technology, any water source whatsoever. We're going to talk about a step-by-step approach to developing a treatment plan. This is the most important aspect. It basically follows a roadmap that if you follow these steps one after the other and look at them succinctly, it will lead you to a finished treatment design. And that's really the ultimate goal, is that finished treatment design. And then we'll talk a little bit about disposal and destruction options, and finally end with the future destruction options that are looking at down the road. I'm going to click through the commercial and go right to our favorite subject, per and polyfluorinated substances. We've heard this a million times. It's the forever chemical. Why is it the forever chemical? It was designed to be the forever chemical. The carbon-fluorine bond is the single strongest bond that is not naturally occurring. Therefore, it doesn't have a natural dissociation method. So because of the strength of this bond, when we start looking at destruction technologies, it's very important to understand that it takes a significant amount of energy to break that bond. And when you're looking at molecular structures that are 8 and 10 and 12 carbons long, there are a lot of carbon-fluorine bonds to break. So destruction technology is something that we're all looking forward to down the road, but it's not ready for prime time today. This presentation is part of a 2.5-hour hazardous management program that the EPA has asked me to give. So what we're going to see is the highlights of that 2.5-hour program. So if any of you are interested in a much more detailed discussion, please see me afterwards. We have a booth outside. The three most important things that we need to understand is the treatment, disposal, and destruction definitions. Treatment is the direct and simple removal of the contaminant from a source. Whether that source is water or soil or air, it is simply the removal. Nothing has been destroyed. It has gone from here to here. Disposal is when we take materials from treatment. This could be medias and filters and bags and equipment, and take that material and sequester it, landfill it, put it someplace where it is going to be disposed of. It is not destroyed at this point in time. So landfills, incinerators, deep wells, these are disposal options. Destruction, however, this is a very distinct definition by the EPA, and that definition says it is the complete disassociation of the carbon-fluorine bonds within the entire molecular structure. So if you have an 8-carbon system and you come along and you chunk out that middle, you now have 2 4s. You did not destroy anything. You have changed the material from a PFOA to something else, so you have destroyed the PFOA, but you still have 2 3-carbon molecules. And unfortunately, they can repolymerize, and you go right back to PFOA and PFOS, which are the most stable forms of PFAS molecules. All the chemistry is trying to get to stability. So as you create these daughter products and sister products and these smaller constituents, they are trying to repolymerize back to PFOA and PFOS. So that's a major problem, and that's why destruction really needs to be looked at in a method of completion. US EPA currently defines upwards of 15,000 chemicals as PFAS. There's up to 6.4 million that can be defined if you use the World Health Organization definition. So it's an astronomical amount of chemistry. Where do we find it? The answer is everywhere. There's no place that you don't have it in. You're wearing it today, you're touching it on the paper, you've washed your hair with it, you're breathing it, it's on the carpets, it's literally everywhere. Why do we care? There is a significant level of toxicity in PFAS molecular structures. It is bioaccumulative. It stays in our biology for a very, very long period of time. Upwards of 15 years is the half-life of PFAS in our systems. It is extremely mobile. It will move with water. It'll move with air. It'll move horizontally, vertically. It moves in the weather. You find it in rain. So it's a highly mobile material, and we really don't understand it. It is persistent. Trying to capture it and break it down is very, very difficult. Groundwater regulations, the regulatory environment of the US EPA establishes regulations. States enforce those regulations. A state regulation can be tighter than a federal regulation, but it cannot be less stringent than the federal regulation. Right now, we don't have a significant focused regulation for groundwater in the United States. There are numbers that as low as 10 parts per trillion and numbers as high as 1,000 to 2,000 parts per trillion. This is going to change. On April the 10th, 2024, the MCLs were initiated by the Biden administration, indicating that there is a specific number now that is targeted for drinking water. PFOA, PFOS, 4 parts per trillion. Do you know what 4 parts per trillion are? 4 parts per trillion is 4 drops of water in 13,200,000 gallons. Let that sink in for a second. You're trying to find 4 very specific drops of water in 20 Olympic swimming pools. PFNA, PFHX, and Gen X, 10 parts per trillion. That is the most surprising change from the 2023 promulgation of the rule. Those were originally as part of the Hazardous Waste Index. My colleague did an excellent job on explaining the Hazardous Waste Index, but that is the only one that became a change. We all expected the 4 parts per trillion. The 10 parts per trillion was kind of a surprise. Public notification is required by any exceedance for any drinking water municipality or regulated drinking water facility. You have to go out and notify your people if you have an exceedance. 1 exceedance, not 10 or 15, 1 exceedance, you have to make notification. Treatment is required for any notification, and this is mandatory. Okay, that's the new map. Like it or not, April 2029, that is the compliance map. Okay? States will be required to regulate. What does that mean? After water, or after drinking water, they're going after leachate, POTWs, pulp and paper. They're going after air permits. We talked quite a bit about CERCLA listing PFAS as a hazardous. It is currently a hazardous substance, which is significantly different than a hazardous waste. But as my colleague said, that's the first step in the long trail to a hazardous waste. Superfund sites may be reopened. That may word is like, no, it will be reopened. As PFAS comes out of some of these closed Superfund sites, they will force you to reopen those sites. So, if we haven't confused you enough, if we haven't created enough fear in you, let's take a breath and talk about treatment. Treatment options, all of the technologies that are commercially available. If we look at the commercially available treatment technologies in descending order of the most effective to the least effective, we would see things like adsorption is the most effective methodology. It is a mass transfer of a component to the outside of the media. There's no chemical reaction. This is very much like what we see in an eel trap. If we have a trap and an eel is swimming along and the eel goes into the trap, he can't go any further, he's entrapped. But if he's smart, he turns around, he goes out the other way. So yes, you can give up material in a adsorption type of technology because there's no chemical reaction, it's holding it together. And carbon, resin, ion exchange resin, and a new product called Dexorb all utilize this adsorption technology. The BAT means it's best available technology, and that is a designation that the EPA provided after taking a look at a media and doing a bunch of tests and just 3 years worth of analytical results on it. They're saying, yeah, this is a good material, it can be used, okay? The only reason why Dexorb doesn't have a BAT technology right now is it didn't exist 3 years ago. So they have not had the time to complete the treatment. And you'll see the same thing with organoclay. Organoclay, Fluorosorb was not under completing their testing for best available technology. Once those tests are completed, it will more likely than not receive a best available technology. Note, the EPA says you can use any technology you wish that is sufficient to meet the 4 parts per trillion. You do not have to use a BAT technology. Okay, it's really important because sometimes it's confusing as to what you can or cannot use. Absorption, think of a sponge. Absorption is the movement of the material within the molecular structure. It is still not a chemical reaction. If you take a sponge and you squeeze it, what happens? It comes back out again. But you can remove material using a absorption type of technology. Organoclay and ion exchange resins do perform this type of method. Ion exchange mechanisms. The ion exchange mechanism is the first mechanism where we have a chemical reaction that's taking place, and here we are taking innocuous ions, such as chlorides in the case of PFAS, creating an ionic charge. The PFAS as an ionic charge at either end, it grabs a hold of that, it locks into it, and it becomes a more likely than not one-way reaction. It takes a lot of energy to break that reaction, so it is something that is very strong, but it also happens very quickly. And we'll see that when we talk about empty bed contact time. The medias that are frequently used in these applications. Now, there's a lot of confusion on media. First of all, media does not destroy anything, right? We talked about that. It's a simple removal of a component from here to here. So we're taking it out of the water and putting into the media. Nothing has been destroyed. It is transferred. For the sake of carbon, carbon is so well known. It's been around for 1,000 years. It treats water for odor and color and taste and hydrocarbons and all of these other things, but it is also a significant place for PFAS treatment. It is the continuous go-to methodology. Some of the problems with carbon we'll talk about in a minute, but virgin or reactivated carbon, if you're looking at drinking water applications, please focus on virgin bituminous carbon. It is the most effective form of carbon 4 drinking water applications. Your goal is to get down to those 4 drops in 13 million gallons. So you want to have the most effective material to do that. It has only the adsorption mechanism. The material is, there are some domestic sources, mostly foreign sources. So if you have a BABA requirement, Buy American, Build American, carbon, you have to look at where your sources come from carbon. There's not that many American sources. There's more coming, but not many right now. And this material is drinking water approved nationally. One of the things about drinking water approvals, states will provide approvals for media. So not every media currently is approved by every state across the board. New York State right now only allows for carbon. Massachusetts allows for carbon and resin and Dexorb and Fluorosorb. So we are working with these states in order to get that approval. So depending on your state, you may want to define what your state's requirements are for that material first, so you can build a system that will be approved by your state. Another adsorption media is called Dexorb. This is a material that comes from corn, so it's a naturally occurring material. It works the same way that carbon does. It works as an entrapment molecule, but this particular material is designed so that the entrapment portion is the perfect size for PFAS molecular impact. So it works very, very quickly. It doesn't take up hydrocarbons. It doesn't take up VOCs. Very few competitive pieces within that waste stream. So if you have a highly contaminated waste stream with other things that are in there, you might start looking towards this Dexorb material. This is not American-made material as well. It is made in a foreign country, brought over to this country for sale. It is made from cornstarch. It is PFAS specific. And the nice thing about this material is it can be regenerated. And in the regeneration process includes the desorption of the material from the Dexorb using an alcohol. Then there's a distillation process which returns the alcohol. Now you have a concentrated PFAS material which can then be subjected to incineration. And incineration is there's a destructive capacity of incineration requires 1500 degrees centigrade, 30 minutes. And then recapturing of the gases that come off that incinerator and then burning those again. So there is a full destruction of the material using a Dexorb. When we get to multifunctional media, these are medias that have more methods of action, not just adsorption. But in the case of organoclay, Fluorosorb is the material of choice. It has an adsorption, absorption, and ion exchange media mechanism. The system has a very, very high kinetics. It works very, very quickly. And I'll show you a comparison of kinetics in a moment. This is a surface-modified, naturally occurring bentonite material that's mined in the United States. So if you have a BABA requirement, Fluorosorb may be your go-to material. But again, you have to look at your state's mandate, whether your state allows this material to be used in drinking water applications. This is a renewable resource, and it is drinking water approved in many states. More and more states are moving towards this material for drinking water approval. Ion exchange material, we all are very familiar with ion exchange material. There is a myriad amount of choices for ion exchange material, but not all ion exchange materials remove PFAS. Ion exchange material for arsenic, for example, will not remove PFAS. So these are very specific. These are designer materials that are designed specifically for PFAS remediation. So make sure that, well, I already have ion exchange in my system. You may not have the right ion exchange material in that system. These are not made in the United States. They come from foreign countries. So if you have a BABA requirement, you may have to have that as a consideration. And are drinking water approved in some states. There are some ion exchange resins that are renewable or regeneratable using the elution of alcohol distillation, and then creation of a concentrate. That concentrate then is destroyed through incineration or other methodologies. If you're going to design a system that is going to use media, it's important to look at the media being in a lead-lag configuration. The reason why you do that is the lead vessel is doing 95% of the work. The lag vessel is acting as a polishing step. When the lead vessel becomes exhausted, you replace the media in the lead vessel, you throw a couple of valves, lead vessel becomes lag vessel, and you go down your merry way. This is the best way to get your system to run that media for the longest possible period of time. Other technologies, if you're looking at remediation technologies, you can use an RO membrane type of a system. For drinking water, it is applicable, but it's very expensive, so you may only be able to use that in large-scale treatment facilities. If you're looking at nanofiltration, it's also very, potentially could be very expensive. It can meet those requirements, but again, you would use nanofiltration in large-scale treatment systems. Electrocoagulation, not frequently used in drinking water applications, more frequently used in landfill, leachate, industrial waters, those kinds of things. But if you're looking at small systems under 50 GPM, you might consider something like that. So where do we start? Here's our roadmap. If you follow these 4 steps, you will get to a system that will meet your requirements directly. Step number 1. Truly understand the source of that water and what you're going to use it for. You don't need to treat for a NIPDES permit levels at 4 parts per trillion if you're not using, if it's not a drinking water application. So understand your water source, whether it's continuous, municipal, is it a bloom? Understand that piece to the puzzle. The second thing, very critical, analyze the water. The more analytical you can have, the more understanding of that water, the more type of knowledge of the PFAS in that water, the co-contaminants, the pH, all of these things will impact your treatment methodology. And by doing that and understanding that, it will lead you to the right system. Understand the treatment requirements. Not every water requirement has to go down to 4 parts per trillion today. Down the road, that may be the case. So if we're starting to see some of these additional methodologies, requirements coming up to 4 parts per trillion, you may want to design a system now that can get you to that level. If it's a long-term treatment system, that's especially important. If it's a short-term treatment system, a remediation project or something along those lines, you may not have to get to that level. And finally, make your decision based on whether it's a permanent system, a temporary system, whether it's, you understand the flow rate, because the flow rate's going to tell us about the size of the equipment, the amount of media required, etc. So all of these bits and pieces will help you define that treatment system. This is a treatment system that is a 20 to 50 gallon a minute treatment system. It uses an ion exchange resin. It's extremely simple. It has a low cost of $58,000 to install. This is a system that can be employed in any rural community. These are larger systems. These are systems that are at 500 GPM. This is an ion exchange media system. Has a price tag of about $165,000 for installation. So again, not every system is a $2, $3, $4 million system. If you design it correctly, you can bring that system down to the sizes and scales that are necessary for that specific application. This is a much larger system. This is a temporary treatment system. This is at an Air Force base where they're treating the transmission of material off base. So you can look at temporary treatment systems as well as permanent treatment systems. Disposal, 3 methods of disposal: landfill, incineration, and deep well injection. For deep well injection, you can only send liquids down there. You cannot send solids down there. Landfills right now, you were allowed non-hazardous waste landfills and hazardous waste landfills. Hazardous waste landfills are preferred, but they're not required. For destruction, it is pretty much focused on incineration at this point in time. The EPA guidelines also include storage. So if you have a mile of AFFF 5-gallon buckets, storage is an option until there is a better methodology of disposing of that material. Deep wells, I said, for liquids only. Landfills, high concentrated PFAS materials, those you should be using the hazardous waste landfills if the concentration is high. If the concentrations are lower, you can use a permitted non-hazardous waste landfill. These are landfills that are Class 1 permits, and that's very, very important to be able to utilize that type of a technology. Thermal destruction, pretty much thermal destruction is focused on incineration at this point in time. There are other technologies, but thermal destruction is incineration. There are a number of permitted incinerators. You should only deal with a permitted incinerator, not just an industrial waste incinerator, but a permitted PFAS incineration system. New technologies that are coming down the pipe, there is a GAC regeneration. Calgon uses it, Tetrasolve uses it. It's basically high heat, high temperature. This material blows off the PFAS from the carbon, destroys that material, but also in so doing, it destroys about 20% of the carbon. So you have an ash to deal with. You have to replenish about 20% of the carbon with some virgin material. It cannot be reused in drinking water applications at this time. That may change down the road, but currently only virgin bituminous is used in drinking water applications. There's an ammox technology which revitalizes the carbon. The way that works is you subject the carbon to a fluidized bed of an oxidizing material that oxidizes off the carbon, off the PFAS, breaking all of the carbon fluorine bonds and destroying the material. It is very effective. It's done at room temperature. The Revive system is the Battelle Annihilator system. It does work. It is mostly designed for AFFF and also for the materials from foam fractionation types of technologies that foam. Inspired Solutions has the PFAcalypse. This is the only one that does reductions. So this is a reduction technology as opposed to an oxidation technology. We have a Clarity for electrochemical oxidation. UV light is very, very experimental. It's not ready for prime time. Plasma thermal destruction is extremely high heat, 2,000 plus degrees centigrade, and it's a small system, very expensive. Black Spark uses a cold plasma type of a system, and there's still more coming. To just give you an idea, destruction is where a lot of money and a lot of research is taking place right now. That was a very brief, very Reader's Digest, very high-level discussion on PFAS remediation technology. I hope it wasn't too much, too soon, too fast. Thanks.
Mr. DeMeo, you're next.
Sorry about that.
You got 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Jorge and I talked about the presentations today, and I think this is my fourth forum. I appreciate Gene putting it together, and your presence here is a testimony to how significant all this has become. But we thought you've heard excellent presentations on the legislative process, the regulatory process, and the remediation processes. So my course materials kind of cover all of it, but I'm going to jump ahead and focus on the litigation part, which is appropriate because when all else fails, that's where you end up in litigation. And you've already heard a little bit about that. By the way, I love the fact that Jorge starts with the Game of Thrones reference. He and I were sitting around at a Peruvian restaurant in Tallahassee trying to come up with a clever title for a Bar Journal article that we wrote, and we came up with PFAcalypse Now, which those of you who are movie fans like me recognize it comes from the Francis Ford Coppola film Apocalypse Now, which is about the Vietnam War. And it is appropriate to use a military metaphor here because some of you may know this already, but I was intrigued to learn that the fluorine technologies, the chemistry that underlies what eventually became the PFAS compounds, was a military application. It started in the 1940s as part of the project to build an atomic bomb. I don't know if any of you knew that. They were looking for highly non-destructive materials, highly heat-resistant materials, and materials that provided other of the many features that developed into fluorine. The very first commercial product use of that in the 60s, some of you might recall, which is Scotchgard. I distinctly remember my mother spraying it on my boots and on my raincoat, and probably on me to keep mud from sticking, right? Well, that had PFAS in it. That was the chemical that kept things from sticking. Then we learned that not only was it capable of absorption of heat, but it also was an excellent anti-stick, so it was used by DuPont, and some of you probably had pots and pans with Teflon on it, okay? It's a little bit scary when you think back to all of that these are very common products that probably everybody here, certainly me growing up in that era, were exposed to. But they started as a military application. I guess that's appropriate also because the very first facilities that were targeted by the state of Florida and the feds were DOD facilities because of their extensive use of that foam product. Obviously, in their munitions practices, testing ranges, put out fires. In fact, this very property that we're on in the convention center is a former Martin Marietta property where they did missile testing right next door, and they used PFAS foam. So it's everywhere, as you've heard. They call it the forever chemical, but I call it the everywhere chemical for that reason. Whenever I get asked by clients, should I test for it, my answer is very cryptic, only if you want to find it. Because if you test for it at any of the many, many, many locations, I represent solid waste facilities, airports, fire training stations, firefighters, wastewater treatment plants, public water systems, and let's just say 100% of the time when you look for it, you find it, okay? There's been a lot of focus on airports. I'm going to talk about that too. Jorge and I represent about half a dozen airports in Florida. Let me start with answering his question, okay? And then I'll jump around a bit. Yes, you can sue the federal government over this. I've actually done so. A long time ago, basically in the 80s, some of you might remember ethylene dibromide, the soil fumigant that was used to control nematodes. I represented the chemical manufacturer of those chemicals, and they were sued by the state of Florida. And what we learned during our discovery process was that the reason it was found everywhere they looked for it, in groundwater, surface water, sediments, you name it, is because much as AFFF foam is mandated by the FAA to be used at commercial airports, the EPA and the USDA mandated that EDB be used, and not just used, but used far in excess of the manufacturer label rates, and basically trenched deep into the ground. Even though it was a fumigant, it was supposed to be applied only to the top 2 inches of the soil. Well, we got sued, and back in 1980s dollars, the state of Florida was looking for about $1 billion to clean up basically the entire state of Florida. Well, when we learned about the role of the federal government, we sued the federal government. And there's a law that is there that allows you to do this. There's a misunderstanding from non-lawyers, even from lawyers, that, well, the federal government's immune. No, it's not. It's called the Federal Tort Claims Act. It allows you to bring lawsuits where you believe the government has acted inappropriately. We brought the suit, and we prevailed. The settlement we got was an admission that it was required for it to be used, and they paid our attorney's fees, and they agreed to put out a statement that then formed the basis of a settlement with the state of Florida. And let me just say that the result of the settlement with the state of Florida was a rule that's on the books to this day for addressing any EDB contamination that's out there in a very, 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 very small fund that the manufacturer provided. Well, the other significance of referencing EDB is it was the first time that we had a number as low as in the parts per trillion, okay? The 0.02 part per billion standard that was set was mind-boggling and unprecedented, as is the 4 parts per trillion number today. And that's going to be, as someone else mentioned, a focus of litigation. The groups that I'm working with are looking into that possibility. Most likely they will be filing a challenge to the final rule. And it's partly because of the fact that it's just not practical. It cannot be implemented meaningfully. Our good friend toxicologist Chris Teef says 4 parts per trillion is effectively 0, okay? And we have representatives of labs here that will tell you most labs can't even detect to that level, which is partly why it's 0. And how reliable is it? And then you've heard about the remediation problems and the challenges that we're facing. So when you put all of this together, what you end up with is you end up with court proceedings. And there are court proceedings going on right now. So I'm going to move right to that in the time remaining. You've heard about the new federal laws. Hang on. Jorge talked about the legislature. I've been working with him on that work group for some time now. So as you can see, this goes back to early 2000s. The DuPont case, by the way, was the subject, continuing kind of the movie and film theme of a feature film called Dark Water, starring Mark Ruffalo. You could bicker about the science and the law that's depicted, but it's generally accurate about what happened. And I highly recommend it. It's very entertaining. There's been documentaries too done on the subject. But we started to see settlements happening in the early 2000s, and the most significant thing that's happened in that arena is what's referred to as multi-district litigation. It's basically a federal court program for dealing with multiple cases on the same subject, largely involving the same defendants. The most famous and the earliest one, some of you might recall, was the Johns Manville asbestos litigation, which started, I think, in the 70s, maybe. I was actually a claimant in that, and it created a multi-billion-dollar fund and a claims management process for presenting claims for those exposed to asbestos. You still see, if you watch late-night TV, the ads for mesothelioma. Well, that's what that's all about, because Johns Manville was the primary manufacturer, just as 3M and DuPont, among others, are the primary manufacturers of the PFAS compounds. By March of 2024, more than 3,000 plaintiffs, I think it's maybe up to 4 or 5 now, 4,000 or 5,000 plaintiffs brought these lawsuits all over the country. They have all been consolidated by federal law into a multi-district litigation managed by a federal judge in the state of South Carolina. And people say, well, why South Carolina? I don't really know why, except they volunteered. I'm sure they regret it now, when there were 5 cases and now there's 5,000. But all these cases are in the same court, managed by basically the same judge. And there's a really a unique litigation process. You don't do your own individual discovery. You rely on the work that's done by a couple of committees. I have 4 cases right now in the multi-district litigation brought on behalf of local governments involving airports, fire training, fire stations, et cetera, public water systems. The very first case that was scheduled to go to trial a few months ago, coincidentally, was the city of Stuart, Florida, in Martin County. Martin County is one of my clients. The airport utilized PFAS for decades. Again, important to keep reminding ourselves, required to be used, okay? And that gets back to my point about suing the federal government. There is a defense that allows you to claim that you were following government law and you had no choice. And it is a defense to a tort-type claim, a claim for product liability, which is essentially what these are. Well, during the discovery process, and of course the manufacturers vehemently denied any liability, much as in the case of the tobacco litigation, some of you remember, actually represented Brown and Williamson in that. So you can see I work both sides of the aisle. They found a document, a smoking gun document, that a lawyer for the tobacco industry, in a moment of conscience, decided to reveal publicly, which said that back in the 30s and 40s, the tobacco companies knew that smoking cigarettes would cause cancer and would result in a lot of mortality, and that was basically deemed by them to be a cost of doing business. And up until that letter was revealed about 20 years ago, the tobacco industry never lost a case that was brought against them by largely the estates of people who died from lung cancer. Since that letter was revealed, they've never won a case. So that tells you how significant it was. Well, I mention that because the analogy to PFAS is the same. Documents were revealed during the discovery process which revealed that 3M, DuPont, and other manufacturers of these products knew about the, number one, the longevity of these chemicals. Again, as you heard, they were developed to be forever chemicals, which means they're everywhere too, and they're not going anywhere. It's found in the blood of anybody whose blood gets tested. Okay, one famous California study of a few years ago, I forget the number, was it 4,000 or 5,000 people whose blood was tested? It was a lot. They found it in everybody's blood, everyone's. There wasn't a single person that didn't have some levels of PFAS in their blood. And that's because of all the various products that I just alluded to. So when that information was revealed through the discovery process, after maybe 6 or 7 years of strong denials by the chemical manufacturers, they eventually agreed to settle. So literally the night before this was supposed to go to trial in the city of Stuart, they settled the case. And just to show you how significant this is, the settlement amount is approximately $12 billion, okay, which is only a drop in the bucket of what the ultimate damages and liability is out there, because this case was only limited to public water systems, which is about 20%, maybe 15% of the total cases out there. The ones I have are so-called environmental cases, where you don't necessarily have a public water system implicated, but you have groundwater, surface water, sediments that are contaminated. Also, I have personal injury cases, none of which are covered. And the other thing I like to say, some of you may remember me saying this last year, was there's not enough gold in Fort Knox to pay the damages and the settlements that are going to come out of this. There's just literally not enough money, because I don't know, a bazillion dollars. I mean, that's what it's going to cost to deal with this problem if, in particular, this recently promulgated final rule goes into final effect. That's what's at stake here, because you cannot meaningfully address it at 4 parts per trillion. And if you have to, if you're forced to, there's going to be a major crisis. And I don't think, I've been doing this 40 years, I can't remember another situation. This makes the EDB problem look, very tiny in comparison. Okay, so moving on, just to give you a flavor, this is Florida alone. These are all of the cases that are pending. Emerald Coast Utilities, that's Pensacola. City of Stuart, I mentioned, Sanford, Pensacola, Tampa Bay, City of Tampa, Hillsborough County Aviation Authority, that's one of mine. City of Melbourne, that's one of mine. Martin County, that's one of mine. Florida Keys, City of Tallahassee, Pasco, et cetera, et cetera. Bartow's the latest one, that's one of mine too. Again, everywhere you look, you find it. There might be legitimate disagreement, according to our toxicology friends, as to what levels and what duration of exposure actually causes the harm. That is a subject in the litigation. But again, the principal defendants have already looked at that, seen the writing on the wall, and decided to settle. So I think you're going to start to see more of these settlements take place. Okay, well, I mentioned City of Stuart. It was back in June, so this is, pretty recent development. There's the settlement number. It's intended to address public water system claims related to drinking water, okay? And by the way, the manufacturers, of course, continue to deny liability, and the settlement documents talk about, well, just to get this over with, et cetera, but they see the writing on the wall. By the way, the $12.5 billion is 3M only. Chemours, DuPont, Corteva, Original, and others are also throwing in another $1.2 billion into the settlement. Now, that third bullet from the bottom is very significant. We've already seen one of the major defendants file for protection from their creditors in bankruptcy court in Delaware. It's because they saw these numbers and said, we can't handle that, okay? And this is one of the big concerns, that if the main culpable parties, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you, putting on my plaintiff's hat, there's virtually no defense to these claims. They don't put up $12, $14 billion if they think there is, okay? I mean, that's just a reality. If they thought their defenses were going to hold, they would have tried the case and let the jury decide. I am very concerned that the principal source of funding, which is not the federal government, which is not the state government, which is certainly not local governments, is going to have to come from where it ought to come from, frankly, and that's the culpable manufacturers. Well, if they start declaring bankruptcy, these types of claims can be extinguished through bankruptcy, and then you're talking about pennies on the dollar, if anything. So it's a reason to be very concerned. And others like Tyco are involved in settlement. That's one of the defendants in my cases. Again, the settlement that's already been reached, and I believe it was recently approved by the federal judge, is only for a public water system that has one or more impacted water sources, okay? And there's a definition for that. If you're interested, you should take a look at this. There's a claim process. People are already starting to receive opt-in, opt-out letters. A multi-district litigation proceeding is not a class action, but it's very similar to one in some of the procedures, one of which is opt-in, opt-out. If you choose to opt out, which my clients have chosen to opt out, the ones that have public water systems that qualify, that means you have to pursue it on your own. The advantage of pursuing a claim on your own is you control your destiny. The disadvantage is there may or may not be any money left at the end of the day if you're not participating in the settlement. That's a strategic decision that they make. Okay. I like this last thing. This comes from my friend Jorge. What is an estimate of the cost to assess and remediate plus personal injury? Your guess is as good as any's, but it'll be very, very large and likely not enough. Again, all the golden Fort Knox. Okay. I mentioned the bankruptcy already. There's already been hearings. And then the end, coming back to the PFAcalypse Now concept. If you haven't seen that movie, you should see it. It's an awesome movie, one of my favorites. Probably, I think, best war movie ever made. But in the opening credits, when the Huey helicopters are flying into Napalm, a village in Cambodia, the Doors song, The End, plays over that in the beginning. And so come full circle to the concept of PFAcalypse Now, but in many ways it really is the end. But I hope that through this discussion, these forums, that will come up with meaningful solutions. But at the end of the day, I don't see any choice but for government, which does have the resources, federal government, to step in. And if they won't do so voluntarily and they have to be challenged, perhaps we can use other legal mechanisms to get them to do the right thing here. So I'll stop now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. We got about 5 to 6 minutes for questions and answers. Any questions out there from the audience? Raise your hand. Don't be shy.
In the back.
There's in the back. There's a question in the back.
You mentioned disposal versus via deep well injection of liquid PFAS. I was wondering if anybody in the audience has had experience with that, and if so, have they permitted an injection well for PFAS disposal?
I can answer that, but is this going to work? I can answer that. There are 6 permitted industrial PFAS wells throughout the United States. What you can put down there is highly filtered material. You can put direct AFFF down into the deep well. It's not cheap. It could be in the $2.50 to $4 a gallon, plus transportation to get it there.
I would answer by saying, as you know, Florida generates millions of gallons of leachate per year. That leachate has to go through a wastewater treatment plant or eventually has to be injected. And so there's some pre-treatment criteria, but bear in mind that landfill leachate likely contains PFAS, and if that is being injected already, yes, PFAS is being injected into a non-drinking aquifer in Florida.
Can I add something to that, please? Florida does allow it, and there are, Florida does allow it, and there are several facilities that are either currently or are in the process of getting permitted for it. And I'm glad someone asked that question, because you heard Jorge say, you know, discharge and disposal even of treated wastewater into wetlands and surface waters is disfavored strongly and arguably violates MPDES. Putting it into a deep well, which has been proven technology for decades, safe and effective despite some of the noise you hear, really may be the best solution.
Yes. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Michael.
With all due respect to learned counsel, just an editorial comment, which I wasn't prepared to make, but I'll now make. Deep injection of PFAS sounds like a lousy idea and a sure source of future litigation and concerns from an environmental justice perspective. I hope it doesn't get traction in Florida at all. I much prefer the earlier concepts that were discussed on this panel, destruction, removal, and the like. But having said that, a question. There was a lot of discussion on this panel about sources of PFAS, great graphics. I didn't see anything about PFAS in pesticides or PFAS in biosolids. I know that at the federal level, there's been a lot of discussion very, very recently, like in the last week even, about PFAS and pesticides. I'm wondering whether anyone on this panel sees that on either the federal regulatory radar screen or in the state of Florida, and also specifically with respect to biosolids in Florida, is that something that the legislature or DEP will take up anytime soon?
Let me start by saying, first of all, Michael and I agree on a lot of things. I couldn't disagree with him more. It's proven to work for decades. But I stopped a biosolids disposal facility, 500 acres in the middle eastern part of the state, because of concerns over high levels of PFAS. So there's not a specific regulation yet because we don't have a criteria yet. But I convinced the DEP and the county that was sponsoring this disposal. So absolutely, and I would give you the same answer for pesticides. It's definitely an area that needs to be looked at.
So EPA has issued significant new use rules to prevent the use of PFAS in pesticides. So there were only a few products left, and those are all inactive now, and they cannot be reactivated without EPA approval. So in terms of continuing the issue, that's been put to rest. Of course, you have the issue of what contamination may have existed from its previous use. And in terms of biosolids, the EPA is in the process of conducting a risk assessment for PFOA and PFOS only in biosolids, and it had to basically overhaul its whole system for how they conduct those risk assessments. So that just completed the process earlier this year. Now they can actually begin the risk assessment process. So it's a very lengthy process. It'll be their goal is the end of this year. It seems unlikely that they will meet that. So sometime next year, maybe, where all you'll have is that risk assessment. Then they have to decide and initiate any kind of rulemaking to address it. So biosolids is probably the furthest off, and it's also where we see the biggest disconnect between state priorities and federal priorities.
I would say eventually will be regulated, though, Michael. I mean, as far as biosolids, it just depends on the results of the risk assessment and DEP adopting those results and going from there. But certainly we all know that they're there, and Florida uses a lot of biosolids in ag. I can foresee agriculture requiring a liability exemption right away. I mean, you know, as powerful politically as ag is in Florida.
Let me add one more thing to it, Michael, and it's an excellent point. I mean, there are screaming high levels of PFAS in wastewater residuals, okay, 10,000 units, you know. Even though, again, it's not regulated per se, we used the concern over free-from criteria, all groundwater and drinking water being free from any pollutant, as a rationale for arguing that the state should not issue a permit, and we managed to convince them, and the applicant withdrew the application after 2 years, and they told me over $2 million of investment because they didn't think they could win, and I don't think they can win on these issues. So there's more to come.
Questions? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, one of the things that I've been seeing throughout this whole presentation, or throughout all the presentations, is that the EPA is really pushing for regulation on PFAS. One of the things, a lot of the data was showing more towards the water treatment, PFAS in water. I was also curious to see if there was any kind of data or restriction or talk as well on more PFAS in the air form as well, if there's the same level of health concern with not only in the water, but also in the air levels as well. And also, I think it's one of the things that Phil talked about in his presentation. He talked about how eventually a lot of the restrictions will keep on going and keep pushing. And one of the things he brought up was that PFAS will be added to the new air permits. I was very curious about what you meant by that, and you could give me an example of that.
It hasn't been added yet to new air permits. That is coming. Okay, what they've got to do right now is they are developing technologies to monitor air. Pine outside has a series of air monitoring equipment that can look at air and determine where it comes from. The problem with PFAS is it likes water and it doesn't like water at the same time, and because air has moisture in it, the PFAS gets into that air and it can travel. I took a group of students from University of Massachusetts up to Arcadia National Park, and we went out to a tree that hadn't been seen by a person for 100 years. We dug into the ground, 3, 6, and 12 inches. We came back to the lab, and all 3 samples had PFAS in it. Well, the signature PFAS that was in there came from Deepwater, Delaware, 740 miles away. And how did it get there? It traveled there through the air patterns, through the weather patterns. So it is a ubiquitous material in every sense of the word.
In terms of EPA and what they're doing about air, so because they were congressionally mandated to develop that destruction and disposal guidance, it really made source air emissions the priority for them. And so they developed a couple of methods to measure for source air. They can't regulate require it for permits until they are listed as hazardous air pollutants.
Correct.
And they have initiated that process to establish that designation, but also a lot of these laws, they've never been utilized, and now they're looking to utilize them for PFAS, and so a lot of work has to be done to kind of fundamentally overhaul the way the law is structured so that they can enact it, and so that's where they're at with the HAPS designation right now, and then they'll be able to require it for permits. And then there are other types of air, right? There's ambient air, there's soil vapor, indoor air, and EPA is not ignoring those. They're spending a lot of time researching and studying the effects, but they just haven't been able to dedicate the resources to developing the methods and the regulations because they had to focus on the source air piece first.
And let me add my maybe favorite fact of all on the topic. Again, Dr. Teef informed me that they found PFAS at the top of Mount Everest, okay, at high levels, and it's largely as a result of air deposition. So there you go, everywhere.
We're about to wrap it. I would only say from a wastewater industry, I think in Florida at least, that is where ratification, the legislature has said, well, we know these substances are going to be regulated in wastewater discharges, not anymore to surface waters of the state. You cannot do that, outfalls. If you at some point in time, you could discharge them out off into the ocean. But I think it all comes down to costs. The wastewater industry, most of them are city utilities. They are beginning to realize that these substances will be regulated in time to a certain surface water quality criteria. But that is where the main issue. It's very easy for a regulatory agency to say, hey, here is your standard and it's your problem, how do you address it? Not really, Who is going to pay? Do we need to increase utility rates? Do we use some of these destruction technologies that Michael is saying? Do we inject some? There's not enough treatment capacity in Florida to treat some of these. There has to be some form of injection. There has to. So I think that's where the legislature is saying, before we react like New York or California or Illinois, let's figure out who's going to pay, how are we going to go pay for it? Because They will be regulated. They have to be regulated. But I think it's a step down or more broader approach. Let's figure out the cost and how we're going to pay for it. I think eventually it's going to have to be a cost borne by society. Your utility rates are going to go up. You know, your wastewater rates are going to go up. If you're an industrial user, not only you have to report, your industrial utility rates are going to have to go up. So we're over time.
Can I
know
mention
this
one
is-
more thing real quick on the
Quick.
cost? It'll just take 30 seconds. When the multi-district litigation first started, the state of Florida evaluated whether it needed to be involved in it. They decided no, they didn't want to be involved. They leave it to the private sector and local governments. Last year, recognizing the writing on the wall, the governor directed the attorney general to file on behalf of the state of Florida its own claim in the multi-district litigation. So that tells you what the state of Florida is thinking about where the money's going to come from, because it's not going to come from them.
There's not enough money. Thank you, everybody. We ran out of time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Very good.
Nice work, guys. I get this bad boy back in there somehow.